This is everything you need to be doing to get a 4.0 GPA, and the same things I did to completely transform my GPA and start getting consistent 4.0s quarter after quarter when I was an undergrad. First, always go to class and sit in the front of class. I know that it's socially difficult to get away from sitting with your friends or sitting in the back of the class and hanging out with people and just chilling out back there, or it could be daunting to sit in the front because you're like, well, now I'm in the front of the class and the professor is making eye contact with me and those kinds of things. But I promise you, when you sit in the front, you're gonna be so much more focused on the class. You're gonna be absorbing so much more information. The professor's gonna get to see you and recognize your face, which can help later on with getting a lot of recommendation. And ultimately, it just makes the time you spend in class so much more effective because you're actually learning the material because you have to focus. You can't get distracted or start going on your phone because you're right in front of the professor and you're like, oh shoot, they may call me out. So always go to class, sit in the front, ideally the front couple of rows. And when you're in class and sitting in the front, make sure to focus on that class. The most important thing is to be attentive, which is kind of what sitting in the front helps you do. But what I mean by that is make sure that your phone is off and your laptop is off and you're not getting distracted by other things. Be very attentive and take notes on what the professor is talking about. And I really want to emphasize the whole point of turning off your phone or laptop, because a lot of times you may get a notification or you start getting bored and the easy thing is to grab for your phone or go on a different website on your laptop. But make sure that those things are off and tucked away unless you're using your phone or laptop to record the lecture, whether it's usually going to be audio, and then you plan on using that audio recording later to listen and maybe fill in any of the gaps, which if you are doing that, just make sure you ask for the professor's permission to record their lecture. But that is definitely something you can do, and what I would recommend if the professor lets you do that, because then you can fill in any gaps in your notes. And that's the next thing I want to talk about is notes. Make sure to write your notes and do it handwritten. Don't type your notes. And the reason why I say this is because there was a study with the best name you could ever give a research paper on the subject, which was called "The Pen is Mightier Than the Keyboard." And that Hallmark study pinpointed the 3 things that are so important when it comes down to taking notes. And specifically, it had to do with the differences between writing notes handwritten or typed. And the first thing had to do with the quality of the notes. So this study showed that the students who took notes by hand tended to produce fewer words but more meaningful and organized words compared to the same people using laptops to take notes. Handwritten notes usually involved summarizing and paraphrasing, which requires you to process and condense information, while people who were taking notes on laptops were much more likely to just transcribe everything the person or professor was saying verbatim, which led to a lot worse memory recall and memory retention. The second point had to do with retention and understanding. So it was pretty much proven that you taking notes by hand leads you to perform better on conceptual questions and you to have a deeper understanding of the material compared to people who take notes on laptops, which pretty much tells us that writing by hand facilitates better learning. The third reason why this study showed that handwriting your notes is so much more effective is because of distraction. Like I was saying earlier, laptops are associated with distractions because the internet is right at your hands and it's easy for you to get distracted with notifications or messages or whatever, which ultimately impede the learning process. On the other hand, when you're taking notes by hand and there's only paper in front of you, there's really not much you can get distracted by. And one of the things that I quickly mentioned that I want to really emphasize is when you're taking notes, don't just rewrite the PowerPoint notes. Focus on listening and then writing down the supplemental information that pretty much summarizes or paraphrases what the professor was saying or the important points. Secondly, you should read the textbook before class. The point of reading the textbook before class is to get introduced to the information before it's presented to you in lecture so that the lecture fills in any gaps in your knowledge and complements your understanding, rather than being confused by so much new information when being introduced to it at a fast pace in the lecture. So you want to essentially prime yourself to what the concepts and topics are that are going to be taught in lecture, so you're already somewhat familiar with it, and that way the lecture only reinforces what you already know, as opposed to being bombarded with so much information during the lecture and trying to keep up with notes. And when you're reading, make sure to actively read. Take notes in a Word document, yes, you can type them this time, while you're reading. Highlight things and read twice if need be. don't move on to the next paragraph until you understand exactly what you just read and it makes complete sense to you. And when you do this, make sure to read ahead of time. What I mean by that is, ideally, you would be focusing on reading pretty much the entire first month of content in the first week of the course. Because come time for midterms, you'll likely be prioritizing studying for your midterms as opposed to reading. So by spending your first week or syllabus week on reading and getting ahead, you're gonna have a good runway that you can kind of fall back on as the semester progresses and things start stacking on top of one another, and you're prioritizing your midterms rather than just constantly reading. My third tip is to follow the 10-24/7 rule. The 10-24/7 rule is a studying guideline designed to help you maximize your learning and retention of information. It emphasizes reviewing your study materials at specific intervals after a lecture or study session. And here's what each part of the 10-24/7 rule means. The 10 stands for 10 minutes. So 10 minutes after class, after your lecture, you want to review your notes or the material that you just learned. And the point of reviewing the material 10 minutes after you learned it is to help reinforce what you just learned. Doing this strengthens your initial understanding and lets you just build upon this, which gets me to the next part, which is the 24. The 24 stands for 24 hours after class. So within 24 hours, revisit that same material again. And this can involve more in-depth review, creating flashcards, summarizing key points, or discussing the materials with friends. The second review is really focused on solidifying your memory and understanding of the content. And you'll probably see once you review the material 10 minutes after class and again 24 hours after class, you're gonna know the material pretty well. But that's when this 7-day review comes in. So the 7 stands for 7 days after learning the material. So 7 days after class, it's time to review that same material once more. And this time you can go over your notes, test yourself with practice questions, or teach the material to one of your friends or someone else in your class. And this spaced repetition reinforces your long-term memory and ensures that you don't forget the material over time. If you follow the 10-27 rule and its principles that are based on spaced repetition and active recall, you are for sure gonna have an enhanced level of learning and memory retention, which is ultimately gonna make you perform so much better on midterms and exams and get you closer to that 4.0 GPA. And the 10-24/7 rule is like magic because it forces you to study with spaced repetition. Spaced repetition meaning you're just spacing out your review sessions over time, which pretty much compartmentalizes things into your long-term memory and reduces what is known as the forgetting curve, which is a phenomenon where pretty much information is just rapidly forgotten if it's not reinforced or reviewed. So review your notes multiple times at increasing intervals, and you're gonna really reinforce those materials and concepts, and you're gonna perform so much better in your exams. And the second thing that the 10-24/7 rule does is it forces active recall. Active recall is forcing you to actively engage with the material by recalling and summarizing the material rather than just passively reading it. So for example, when I talked about going through the material a second time or third time during the 24-hour period or the 7-day period, it's all about creating flashcards, quizzing yourself, teaching the material to someone else, doing something other than just passively reading your notes. And that active style of quizzing yourself, teaching someone else, etc., really reinforces the knowledge that you have and identifies anywhere where you may have a gap that you then know you need to fill. So do this, it's gonna help a lot. And my fourth study tip kind of piggybacks off of what I was just talking about with studying actively. And that is the fourth tip, study actively. So you don't want to just highlight your notes or reread them. You want to fill in your notes with anything you missed, which is a great time to rewatch a lecture or listen to your audio recording. You also want to make up your own questions in your head or on Quizlet or on flashcards. So give yourself practice exam questions. When you're going through the material, think, based on this fact that I just learned, what's a question that my professor can ask me or quiz me on in an actual exam? Ask yourself questions rather than just reading statements and notes. My fifth point is about how you go about studying for midterms and final exams. So on top of getting the spaced repetition and active learning principles, asking yourself questions, teaching the material, utilizing flashcards, as basic as they sound, they work really well, make sure you start studying for midterms and final exams at least 1 week before the exam. And when studying, again, don't just reread your notes. You should be actively studying, using flashcards, explaining and teaching the concepts, or going through practice exams to really reinforce and make sure your knowledge is exactly where it's at. But give yourself that 7-day runway before the midterm or exam to start studying. And when I was in college and I was realizing that my study techniques just were not working, one of the things I diagnosed, and maybe you're doing this too, initially I would just reread the notes. So I would go through my notes or the lecture slides and I'd look at them and kind of just nod and be like, yeah, that makes sense, and move on to the next slide and just keep doing that. And what I realized was that was really ineffective. And that's when I realized flashcards are really effective because they force you to actually come up with the answer on your own rather than looking at the answer and then just nodding. I know this sounds super simple, but I'm hoping to help someone who maybe was in shoes that I was in when I was just reading my notes or looking at the lecture slides and nodding my head and being like, this makes sense, and moving on, because that is definitely not the way to go about this. And then when you go through the practice exams, make sure you're not just doing them and then guessing on some, getting questions right, or even just getting questions wrong and thinking, okay, well, I got an A- or an A on that practice exam, perfect, I'm good to go. Make sure that you mark any question that you guessed on and then revisit it and revisit the topic and concept, and perhaps even that point in the lecture where that concept is talked about, so you fully grasp the material. Same thing goes with questions you get wrong. Identify questions you get wrong, go back in the lecture, the textbook, and really reread it over again so that that concept never catches you off guard again. And if that concept's ever tested on the actual exam, you ace it. Number 6, utilize office hours. Office hours are the best time to clarify concepts on topics you find challenging, and I wouldn't hold back with asking questions no matter how basic or simple they may seem to you, because your professors are there to help you understand the material, and if you have a question, frankly, it's probably very likely that someone else has that same question. I know I used to think that when I was confused on a simple or basic topic in the lecture, that it probably was just me. But what I quickly realized when talking to other people is everyone had pretty much the same questions because it didn't make sense to pretty much anyone. So take advantage of office hours and the one-on-one interactions that can provide you with valuable insights that sometimes a lecture just doesn't provide you with. And going to office hours, even when you might not have questions, can also be super valuable, because sometimes it's listening to other people's questions and their understanding of the material that can then provoke questions in your mind or make you realize that you didn't actually fully understand the topic as well as you initially thought. That happened to me almost every single time I went to office hours, even when I thought I knew the material super well and when I was getting A's on midterm exams, and I'll just continue to go in before the final exam. And secondly, use office hours to dive deeper. If you're passionate about a particular subject or topic covered in class, or just curious about the real world applications of the topic, office hours are the best time to dive deeper, and diving deeper is what usually leads to truly mastering the material and really getting to that point where you know you will for sure get an A and there's nothing that can trick you on the exam. It's also a huge bonus because as a Predental, you're going to need to ask for a letter of recommendation from science professors. So going to these office hours, forcing yourself to go there, showing that interest and that curiosity with wanting to dive deeper in the lecture material can be great for when it comes time to ask the professor for a letter of recommendation and having them have content and substance to write in your letter of recommendation, aside from just mentioning that you got an A in the course. Another tip that I 100% recommend running with is study for the 100%. What I mean by that is don't just study for an A and don't just study for getting an A-. Whenever we set our targets, the problem is we usually fall short, especially when it comes to exams. And the reason why is because professors may throw in a tricky question or a few tricky questions. And those little vulnerabilities really stack up and drop our grade a lot on exams. So when you study for the 100%, you're focused on knowing absolutely everything. So there's nothing that can trick you. And that's when you end up getting the 95, 96, 97, 99, 100%. When you study for the A-, at least this is what happened to me, I'd always end up with a B or a B+. I always fall a little bit below because my vulnerabilities got me on the actual exam. A time when this especially happened was when I was in my physiology course and I had a solid A in the course. And it was a really tough course, and the professor said, since there's been so many people who've been performing well in the course, I'm gonna make the final exam a lot easier for you guys, to give you guys a break. And there was one topic that I did not focus on studying. And that one topic ended up being 25% of the exam. There was a chart on the exam and there was question after question after question. That was the one thing I did not study, was that chart that was shown on the exam. It was a graph of an EKG telling us what all the different things stood for. And it's imprinted in my memory because it scarred me, because during the exam, I looked at it and I was like, there is no way that this is 25% of our exam, because it's the one thing I did not study, because she said it was going to be an easy exam and I knew everything else so well. None of the other stuff mattered. I knew everything else to 100%. This one thing dropped me to a B+, and it completely took that A away from me. And that's when I learned you always need to study for the 100%, because the one thing you don't study for can be your biggest vulnerability and completely destroy your grade. My 7th tip to securing a 4.0 GPA is to take the time to do things that keep you mentally sharp. So we obviously can't be studying 24/7, and none of these tips are focused on studying more. In fact, if you implement a lot of these tips, you'll probably end up studying less. At least that's what happened to me. I studied less and started getting way better grades, especially with the 10 24/7 rule and flashcards. But anyways, with staying mentally sharp, do things that will help you relax, de-stress, and just keep you on top of your game. For some people, that means going and exercising, going to the gym, doing yoga, meditation, hanging out with friends. Whatever it is that helps you de-stress, make the time to do things that are fun so you remain energized and mentally sharp. It's gonna help you just learn so much better and be your best sharp self. Start implementing these tips and these tools, and once you start getting on a roll with building A's, you're gonna start gaining the confidence and be even more motivated to continue studying hard, implementing these different things, and continue to get A's. And hopefully this gets you the 4.0 after 4.0 after 4.0 that it got me and has gotten some of my students.